Have you ever smiled in a moment when deep down you actually felt your heart drop? Have you ever sat there so stunned by someone's disrespect that you couldn't even react right away? And what would you do if on your very first day as a daughter-in-law, the woman who was supposed to welcome you into the family looked you in the eye and made it clear that in her house, you were not a wife, not an equal, not even a guest, just the last person allowed to eat? Because that was the moment I realized marriage doesn't always begin with love. Sometimes it begins with a test. And sometimes that test is not about how much you can give, it's about how much humiliation you're willing to swallow before people decide that is your permanent place in their home. My mother-in-law didn't scream when she did it. She didn't need to. That's what made it worse. She said it the way people announce rules they expect to be obeyed without question. Calm, casual, certain, like she was simply explaining how things were done. She looked at me on my very first day as a daughter-in-law and said that in this family, I would cook, serve everyone, and only eat after the whole family had finished. Not beside them, not with them, after them. Let that sink in. Have you ever been insulted so politely that for a second you almost doubted whether you were allowed to feel hurt? Have you ever looked around the room hoping someone, anyone, would say, "No, that's not right," but realized the silence itself was part of the humiliation? Because that was the part that really burned. Not just her words, the way the room held them, the way nobody rushed to correct her, the way I suddenly understood that this wasn't a random comment, this was a line being drawn, and I was supposed to step quietly behind it. I smiled. And that smile was not weakness. It was shock. It was survival. It was the kind of smile women wear when they understand that reacting too fast can get them labeled before they get the chance to tell their side. Especially a Black woman. Because, let's be honest, there are rooms where the minute you defend yourself, you stop being hurt and start being difficult. The minute you question disrespect, you become too sensitive. The minute your voice hardens, people stop asking what was done to you and start talking about your attitude. So yes, I smiled. I agreed. I let my mother-in-law believe I had accepted the rule. She thought she had won something that day. She thought she had taught the new bride her place. She thought I was one more woman entering that house ready to bend. But what she didn't understand was this. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the moment a woman realizes exactly who she's dealing with. Sometimes it's the second before dignity changes shape and becomes strategy. Because I went to bed that night with one thought pounding in my chest. If I accept this once, I will be expected to accept it forever. If I let them feed me disrespect on day one, they will call it tradition by day two. And if I didn't stop it immediately, then every meal after that would come with the same message. You are here to serve, not belong. So, the next morning, I did something nobody in that house expected. I refused to cook. And when my mother-in-law demanded to know why, I said one sentence that left the whole room so quiet you could hear people breathing. That was the moment everything changed. And if you've ever been welcomed into a room only to realize you were actually being sized up for obedience, stay with me. Because what happened next turned one cruel little family rule into the day they all learned I was not the kind of woman who would eat last while everyone else swallowed my dignity first. If I had asked me before the wedding what I was most afraid of, I probably wouldn't have said heartbreak. I wouldn't even have said marriage itself. My real fear was quieter than that, and in some ways more embarrassing to admit. I was afraid of entering a family that had already decided who I was before I ever got the chance to show them. afraid of being judged too quickly, too harshly, and in all the familiar ways women like me so often are. Too independent, too outspoken, too educated, too polished, too proud, or somehow, if I tried hard enough to be warm and accommodating, still not enough in the right places. That's the exhausting thing about walking into certain spaces as a Black woman. You're aware, sometimes before a word is even spoken, that people may not be meeting you as a person first. They may be meeting an idea of you, a stereotype, a warning, a challenge. And you have to decide in real time how much of yourself to show, soften, or protect. I carried that fear quietly into my marriage because I loved my husband, and I wanted to believe love could make difficult things simpler. I wanted to believe that if two people chose each other honestly, the rest could be worked out with enough grace, patience, and mutual respect. That sounds naive now, maybe, but at the time it didn't feel foolish. It felt hopeful. It felt like the kind of faith most women are told to bring into marriage. Be loving, be respectful, be flexible, be patient with his family, keep the peace while everyone adjusts. I had heard versions of that advice my whole life, and I had every intention of following it, up to the point where peace did not ask me to betray myself. My husband, at least the man I believed I was marrying, felt safe. That matters. He wasn't one of those flashy men who sweep you up with grand gestures and leave you dizzy with uncertainty. He felt steady, kind, thoughtful, in a way that seemed sincere, not performed. He listened, he remembered things, he knew how to make me laugh after a long day, and he never seemed threatened by my mind or my ambition, which, if I'm being honest, was part of what drew me to him so deeply. A lot of women know what it feels like to shrink themselves around insecure men. He did not seem like that. At least, not with me. He said he admired my strength, said he loved the way I carried myself, said I was the kind of woman who made a room feel more grounded just by entering it. And after enough disappointing experiences with men who were attracted to confidence, until it required them to respect it, that kind of love felt rare. What I didn't understand then was that a good man in private can still become a weak man in front of his family. And weakness, when left unchallenged, becomes its own kind of betrayal. I met his mother early in our relationship, and if I'm honest, something in me tightened almost immediately. Not because she was openly rude, she was too experienced for that. Women like her rarely waste power on obvious cruelty in the beginning. They prefer layers. She was warm enough to remain blameless if I ever complained, polite enough that anything I sensed would sound petty if I said it out loud. But there were little things. A pause too long before returning a compliment. Questions that looked innocent but felt like inspections. A special kind of smile that did not quite reach her eyes when she looked at me for too long. She wanted information, not connection. She wanted to know where I came from, how I was raised, what kind of woman I was, and most of all, whether I understood the kind of family I was entering. I remember one of the earliest dinners at her house. Everyone was gathered around the table, and she asked me whether I cooked. Not in a casual way, not in a getting-to-know-you way, in that old-school, evaluating kind of way, where the answer is not really about food, it's about role. I smiled and said yes, I could cook. She nodded slowly and asked what kinds of meals I made for a man. That phrasing sat strangely with me, but I answered politely. Then she asked whether I believed a wife should take care of her home first before all this career business starts crowding her priorities. Everyone laughed lightly, like she was just being from another generation, just being traditional, just being her. I laughed too, but inside I felt that tiny internal shift I've learned not to ignore. The one that says, pay attention. This isn't random. That became the pattern with her. Nothing sharp enough to confront cleanly, just enough to remind me that in her eyes, I was being measured against a standard I had never agreed to. She made comments about women these days, about wives losing their natural softness, about households falling apart because too many women wanted partnership instead of structure, about how in her day, a woman knew respect for elders and service to family made a marriage strong. Always indirect, always broad enough to sound like general commentary rather than a targeted message, but the messages landed where they were meant to. And my husband, he would usually just smile awkwardly, or tell me later not to take my mother too seriously, or say, "You know how she is." I came to hate that sentence more than I can explain. You know how she is. It's one of those phrases people use when they want you to normalize disrespect because confronting it would require courage they don't have. What they really mean is, please absorb this so I don't have to deal with it. Please be mature enough to carry what I am too afraid to address. Please let my comfort matter more than your dignity. I didn't say all that then, of course. Then I was still trying to be fair, still trying to make room for cultural differences, generational differences, family dynamics I didn't fully understand yet. I gave her grace because I wanted peace, and because women are taught to feel noble when they overextend understanding to people who have done very little to earn it. And to be fair, there were moments when I thought things might settle. Little moments. She'd praise something I wore. She'd tell a story from my husband's childhood and include me in the laughter. She'd ask me to help in the kitchen, and for 10 or 15 minutes it would almost feel normal, almost feel warm. I learned very quickly that those moments mattered more to me than they did to her. I treated them like signs we were building something. She treated them like fluctuations in the same hierarchy she never stopped believing in. That hierarchy became clearer the closer the wedding got. She got more involved in decisions than I wanted, and every attempt I made to set a boundary was treated like a personal slight. If I preferred something different, she acted wounded. If I spoke firmly, she looked at my husband as if to say, "This is what you're marrying?" If I compromised, she accepted it like her authority had naturally prevailed. It was all so subtle that sometimes even I questioned myself. Was I being too sensitive? Was I making too much of normal in-law tension? Was this just the stress of wedding planning? Again, that's how these things work. Not enough to justify a dramatic stand, just enough to slowly train you into tolerating more than you should. One evening, not long before the wedding, I asked my husband directly what he planned to do if his mother overstepped after we were married. We were sitting in his car, and I remember the way the streetlights moved across his face while he thought about his answer. He said, "She means well, she just has strong opinions. Once she sees we're happy, she'll settle down." I pressed him. I asked, "But if she doesn't?" He reached for my hand and said, "I won't let anyone disrespect you." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. Because if you can't trust your future husband to protect your dignity in his own family, what exactly are you stepping into? So, I chose hope. Even with all my unease, I chose hope. I told myself marriage creates its own center, that once we were husband and wife, our unit would matter most, that his loyalty would become clearer, that her mother might test me, yes, but not in ways she couldn't eventually respect. After all, I wasn't entering that marriage looking for power. I wasn't trying to dominate anyone's household or challenge anyone's place. I simply wanted to be treated like a human being with equal dignity. I wanted to love my husband and build a home with him that felt rooted in mutual care, not old power games disguised as tradition. But there was one thing I kept noticing in his family that I should have taken more seriously. The women served, the men expected, and her mother presided. The moment itself was so ordinary on the surface that if you walked into the room without context, you might have missed how much power was moving through it. That's what made it so chilling. There was no shouting, no open insult, no dramatic confrontation with everyone gasping and pretending to restore order. Just a family meal being prepared, dishes clinking in the kitchen, voices moving in and out of each other, the smell of spices and hot oil in the air, and me standing there in that strange emotional state new brides know too well, trying to look calm while quietly measuring everything around me. It was my first day in that house as a daughter-in-law, and already I was hyper-aware of myself, my posture, my tone, my expression, the way I moved, the way I answered, the way I smiled. Because on a first day like that, you're not just arriving, you're being watched. You feel it in the room before anyone says a word. You feel when a family is deciding what kind of woman you're going to be allowed to be in their world. My mother-in-law had been directing the kitchen from the moment I stepped in, not loudly, efficiently, like a woman who didn't need to announce authority because everyone else already moved around it. She told one person to set the table, another to bring the drinks, and then looked at me with that calm, assessing expression I had come to know too well, and said, "Come, let me show you how things are done here." It was said with a smile, but not the kind meant to comfort, the kind meant to establish. I followed her because what else was I going to do in that moment? Refuse on the spot and become the difficult bride before I had even put down my bag? So I followed. And that, I think, is the part people misunderstand when they imagine women allowing things to happen. Sometimes the first instinct is not submission, it's orientation. You're trying to understand what kind of room you're in before you decide how to survive it. She moved around the kitchen as if she were narrating a legacy. Which pots were used for which dishes, how the men liked their food, who ate spicy, who did not, which serving bowl belonged on the table first, when to pour the tea, how to know when the bread was warm enough to bring out. It was all wrapped in the language of family care, but underneath it was something else. Something instructional in a way that had nothing to do with helping me settle in, and everything to do with placing me properly. There was no curiosity about me in it. No, what do you usually do? No, what meals do you like making? No, let's figure this out together. It was a transfer of expectation, not a welcome. Then, when everything was ready and people started gathering around the table, she said it. She didn't pull me aside. She didn't say it quietly, woman to woman, as something we could discuss later. She said it where everyone could hear, because rules only become powerful when they are witnessed. She glanced at me and said, in that composed voice of hers, "In this house, the daughter-in-law serves the meal and eats after the whole family has finished." For a second, I truly thought I had misheard her. Not because the words were unclear, but because some part of me still wanted to believe there had to be another meaning, another layer, a joke maybe, some old-fashioned comment she would soften with a laugh. But no one laughed. No one rushed to reinterpret it. No one looked offended on my behalf. The room just absorbed the sentence and kept breathing as though this was normal. That is when the humiliation fully landed. Not just in her words, but in the silence that followed them. The silence of a system already in place. My face stayed still, but inside, something dropped hard. Have you ever been so stunned that your body reacts before your thoughts do? My chest tightened. My hands felt cold. I suddenly became aware of the plates in my hands, the steam rising from the food, the scrape of chairs as people sat down. And beneath all of that, one devastating realization. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an announcement of my place. And in moments like that, your eyes go to the person you love. I looked at my husband. I did not make a scene. I did not plead with my eyes in some dramatic way, but I looked at him the way a wife looks at the one person in the room who is supposed to understand the difference between peace and humiliation. I looked at him waiting for the smallest thing. A correction, a "Mom, come on," a hand on my back, a simple "She'll eat with us." Anything. I wasn't asking him to burn the house down. I was asking him to show me in one sentence that becoming his wife had not made her also available for degradation. He shifted in his seat. That's what I remember most. Not outrage, not protection, a shift. A tiny, uncomfortable movement, like a man caught between the truth and the habit of avoiding conflict. Then he gave me the kind of weak, useless half-smile that says more than no words ever could. The smile of someone hoping the moment will pass if nobody makes it bigger. He said, It's just how things are done here, quietly. That sentence hurt almost more than hers, because now it wasn't just my mother-in-law testing my dignity, it was my husband asking me to absorb the insult quietly because it keeps his life easier. It was the first crack in the image of marriage I had built in my head. In that one moment, I understood something devastatingly clearly. Love means very little if it disappears the second loyalty becomes uncomfortable. I wanted to ask him, not take it personally? How exactly does a woman not take it personally when she is told on her first day as family that she must stand aside and wait for permission to eat? How do you not take it personally when the message is not subtle at all? Serve first, matter later, belong only through usefulness. But I said none of that. Not because I felt none of it, because I felt too much. My mother-in-law noticed my silence immediately, and I could see the satisfaction flicker across her face. She had done this before. Maybe not to me, but this dance was not new to her. She knew the power of setting the tone early. She knew the effect of humiliating someone politely enough that if they reacted, they would look unstable in front of everyone who had just sat down to eat. She wanted to see whether I would protest, and if I did, she was ready. I could almost hear the next lines waiting behind her eyes. In this house, we respect elders. We all had to adjust. You modern girls don't understand tradition. No one is humiliating you. Why are you being dramatic? Women like her always prepare innocence in advance. That is how they keep control looking respectable. So I smiled, and I heard my own voice say, "Of course." Even now, remembering it makes my stomach tighten, because I know how that looked to the room. Compliance, acceptance, a new bride willing to learn. My mother-in-law took it exactly that way. She nodded once, satisfied, and sat down as if some important ceremony had been completed. The others followed her lead. Plates were passed, food was served, conversations resumed, and there I was, standing just outside the table's warmth, expected to continue moving while everyone else settled into comfort, as though my place in the room had already been decided forever. That first meal lasted an eternity. I served them, I placed dishes down, refilled water, brought extra bread, listened to small talk move around me like I was both present and not fully human. Do you know what hurts about that kind of moment? It's not just being disrespected, it's being made invisible while your labor remains completely visible. People looked at the food, the plates, each other. Not at me, not really. I had already become function, and because I was raised with manners, because I knew how to carry myself, because years of social conditioning had trained me not to let pain immediately distort my face, I performed calm, while something inside me was bleeding. I noticed everything in those moments. The way one aunt gave me a sympathetic glance but said nothing, the way one of the younger women kept her eyes down, like she had seen this kind of thing before and knew silence was safer, the way my husband avoided looking at me directly for too long, the way my mother-in-law ate with the slow, composed confidence of a woman who believed she had just secured control of the new order. She wasn't just making me eat last, she was showing the house that I had accepted it. And maybe that's why I made myself stay so still. Because while I was serving, something sharper than humiliation began to form underneath it. Clarity. Clean, painful clarity. I understood that if I reacted in that moment, I would be reacting on ground she had prepared. Her table, her audience, her tradition. Her timing. I would not be heard as a woman defending her dignity. I would be framed as a bride refusing to adjust, a disrespectful young wife making trouble in her new home before the marriage had even settled. She knew that. And once I saw that clearly, my silence stopped being confusion and started becoming observation. What made it worse, strangely enough, was that my body was genuinely hungry.
That sounds like a small detail, but it mattered. Weddings and travel and greetings and rituals had already made the day long. I had barely eaten properly. I was tired, emotionally stretched thin, and standing there breathing in the smell of food I had helped prepare while being told I would have to wait until everyone else was finished before I was allowed to eat what was left. That message was physical as much as symbolic. Your needs come after ours. Your hunger comes after our comfort. Your
body itself must learn to wait. That is not tradition, that is hierarchy. And I knew it, even if no one else in that room was willing to say it out loud. When the meal finally ended, plates half empty, conversations slowing, people leaning back in their chairs with the ease of being full and satisfied, my mother-in-law looked at the table and then at me and said, "Now you can eat." She said it almost kindly, which somehow made it even more insulting, like permission, like I was a child being rewarded for obedience. I looked at the plates, at the picked-over dishes, at the casual entitlement of people who had just eaten in comfort while testing how much of myself I was willing to swallow. And in that exact moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I sat down and accepted this, I would be teaching them how to treat me for the rest of my marriage. Not just my mother-in-law, everyone, my husband especially. That was the core of the conflict. Not the food, not even the table. The future hidden inside that first small humiliation. Because households are built through repetition, through what gets named and what gets normalized, through what a woman absorbs the first time someone tells her to wait her turn for dignity. If she accepts it once, they call it custom. If she resists later, they call it change. And change always sounds like rebellion to people who benefited from the old arrangement. I sat down only briefly that night, enough to avoid immediate drama, enough to preserve the illusion she thought she had secured. But I barely tasted the food. My mind was too loud. Every bite felt like a warning. Every second in that kitchen afterwards, washing dishes while voices drifted from the other room, felt like my life was dividing itself into before and after. Before that meal, I still had the option of believing discomfort might settle into respect. After that meal, I knew better. The house had spoken. More importantly, my husband had spoken too, through his silence, through his weak excuse, through his unwillingness to interrupt the humiliation while it was happening. That night, when we were finally alone, I gave him one more chance. I asked him directly, "Did you really think that was okay?" He looked tired, irritated even, as if I was making a manageable situation more difficult than it needed to be. He said, "It was one meal. Why are you turning this into something bigger?" One meal, that's what he called it. Not because he didn't understand, because minimizing it protected him. If it was one meal, then he had not failed me. If it was one meal, then I was overreacting. If it was one meal, then his mother had not humiliated me in front of the family. She had just been old-fashioned, and I had been too sensitive. That was when the loneliness truly arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, just cold. The loneliness of realizing the person next to you is more committed to avoiding discomfort than confronting your pain. The loneliness of understanding that your first battle in a marriage might not be with the person who insults you, but the person who asks you to accept the insult quietly because it keeps his life easier. I didn't argue with him for long. There was no point. Not then. Men who are still protecting the system that benefits them rarely hear truth the first time it's spoken softly. So, I went quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not shocked, not wounded, focused. I lay awake that night replaying every second of that meal. Her voice, his silence, the room, the table, the sentence, "Now you can eat." And beneath it all, one realization kept growing until it became impossible to ignore. They thought that first day had broken me into the role they wanted. They thought my smile meant yes. They thought I would wake up the next morning and continue the performance, grateful enough to belong that I would never question the price. What they did not know was that I had already decided the next morning would be different.
And when morning came, the kitchen they expected to find me in was not where the real story began. The real story began with the fact that I was done being tested through hunger and called respectful for enduring it.
When my mother-in-law asked, "So what exactly are you trying to say?" the room changed in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived through a moment like that. People think silence is empty, but it isn't. Silence can be crowded. It can hold shock, fear, anger, denial, and anticipation all at once. That room was full of all of it. Every eye was on me, but not in the same way they had been the day before. The day before, I had been the new bride under inspection. That morning, I was something else entirely. A disruption, a question mark, a woman about to either fold back into the role assigned to her or say the thing everyone had been hoping she would be too polite, too new, too careful to say out loud. And I knew right there that whatever came out of my mouth next would define everything after it. Not just breakfast, not just that week, possibly my whole marriage, because some sentences are not mere responses, they are declarations of self. They tell a room what you believe your life is worth. They tell the people watching whether your kindness can be mistaken for compliance. They tell the person who has tested you whether they have found a boundary or just another woman they can train. That was the weight pressing into my chest. As I looked at her, my heart was beating hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. But strangely, my voice came out calm, almost too calm, the kind that unsettles people because it sounds less like emotion and more like truth finally choosing a shape. I looked directly at my mother-in-law and said, "If I'm expected to eat last like a servant, then this house can learn to cook without one." No one moved, not for a second, maybe two, maybe three. I still remember the look on her face because it was not just anger, it was exposure. That was what stunned her, not the refusal alone, the fact that I had stripped all the pretty family language off her rule and named the role she was really assigning me, servant. That was the word she never expected to hear out loud, because control survives best when no one names it plainly. The minute you do, everyone in the room is forced to hear the thing they were all pretending not to hear. You can call it tradition, culture, family values, house rules, respect for elders, whatever sounds respectable enough to protect it. But once someone says the word servant, the whole disguise starts to slip. My husband's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. One of the other women in the room inhaled so sharply it was almost a gasp. My mother-in-law stared at me with a kind of offended disbelief, the way powerful people often do when someone lower in the structure not only resists, but does so with language strong enough to puncture the hierarchy itself. She expected apology, defensiveness, tears maybe, but not clarity. Never clarity. She recovered quickly, or tried to. She said, "How dare you? How dare you speak like that in my house after everything we've done for you?" That line told me she was flailing already. Everything we've done for you. It's amazing how often people weaponize generosity after disrespecting you, as though basic inclusion gives them the right to humiliate you later. I could feel the room shifting under that sentence, too. Some people looked down, some looked at her, some looked at me, because even if they weren't ready to side with me, everyone knew the problem was no longer hidden. We were no longer discussing breakfast, we were discussing worth. And I said, still calm, "What you did for me was welcome me into this house and tell me I was allowed to eat only after everyone else was done. If that is your idea of family, then yes, I heard you clearly." That was the turning point. Not because I won the room immediately, not because she backed down, she didn't, not yet, but because from that moment on, she could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. She could no longer retreat into vague language and act like I had invented the insult in my own sensitive imagination. I had repeated her rule plainly, in front of witnesses, in a voice that did not tremble. And once truth is repeated clearly, people may still reject it, but they cannot claim they never heard it. My mother-in-law took one step closer and pointed towards the kitchen. In this family, women show respect through service. If you have a problem with that, then maybe you were not raised to understand what marriage really requires. There it was, the oldest trick in the book. If a woman objects to humiliation, question her bring-up, question her character, question whether she was raised properly. I had heard versions of that all my life in one form or another. Dress your boundaries as moral failure. Suggest that self-respect is arrogance. Suggest that a woman who refuses to overserve simply doesn't understand love. But because I was no longer inside the shock of the first day, her line didn't land the way she wanted. It only made her more visible. She was no longer the dignified elder preserving values. She was a woman trying to shame another woman into unpaid obedience by calling it marriage. And maybe the most powerful part of the turning point was that once she said that, the room had to reckon not just with me, but with themselves. Because if service is respect, why only from women? If family means feeding others first, why was no man in that room ever told to prove his love by eating scraps at the end? Why was my hunger a lesson, but theirs was simply expected to be met? Those questions were hanging in the air now, whether anyone said them or not. That is what truth does when it lands properly. My husband finally spoke then, but his voice lacked the authority the moment required. He said, "Mom, maybe we should all just calm down." Calm down, another phrase I had come to hate. Not because calm is bad, but because people only seem to ask for calm once the person with less power starts defending themselves. No one had asked her mother to calm down when she publicly put me at the bottom of the table. No one had asked the room to calm down while I stood serving in silence. But now, with the lie exposed, suddenly everyone wanted peace. That's how you know peace has been built on your silence. I turned to him and asked, "Do you think what she said yesterday was respectful?" Just that. One direct question. His face changed immediately, because it is one thing to hide behind atmosphere, behind tradition, behind avoidance. It is another thing to be asked plainly in front of your family and your wife whether she actually believes she should have to wait until everyone else finishes eating before she is allowed to sit down. He looked at his mother first. That told me everything. Even before he answered, he had already revealed where his instinctive loyalty still lived. He said, "I think this is being blown out of proportion. There are moments when your heart breaks quietly, not because something new has happened, but because the thing you were hoping was still uncertain becomes undeniable." That was one of those moments for me. I felt the sadness of it, yes, but strangely I also felt relief, because his answer freed me from one last illusion. He was not confused. He was choosing. He was choosing discomfort avoidance over truth. He was choosing his mother's approval over my dignity. He was choosing the family script over the woman he had married. And once I knew that fully, I stopped trying to save him from that truth too. I looked back at my mother-in-law and said, "Then let me make this proportionate. I will not cook in a home where I am not allowed to sit and eat as family. If I am only welcome here as labor, then you don't want a daughter-in-law, you want help." That was the line, the one that landed so hard the room seemed to freeze around it, because it did more than defend me, it named the entire arrangement. Help. labor, daughter-in-law, family. It drew the distinction no one wanted made explicit, and once it was said, my mother-in-law's authority took its first real blow, not because she had suddenly become powerless, but because she had become visible in a new and uncomfortable way. The moral high ground she thought she stood on was slipping. She tried to laugh then, but it came out brittle. She said, "You think too highly of yourself. Nobody is making you a servant." But even she did not sound convinced anymore, because the room had heard enough. They had heard her original rule. They had heard me repeat it. They had heard her defend service as a woman's duty. They had heard my husband refuse to call the insult what it was. The lines had sharpened. The fog was gone. And in that kind of clarity, denial starts sounding desperate. One of the older women in the room, who had been silent until then, shifted in her chair and said softly, almost to herself, "Eating after everyone else is not the same as respect." It was not a dramatic speech, barely above a murmur, but it mattered, more than anyone there probably realized, because once another woman acknowledged the truth, even gently, the room could no longer pretend this was just my modern attitude or my wounded pride. The room had cracked, just enough for possibility to enter. My mother-in-law swung her gaze toward that woman immediately, shocked by the betrayal, but it was too late. Support, even tiny, changes the emotional temperature of a confrontation. It tells the target she is not crazy. It tells the aggressor their version of events is no longer uncontested, and it tells everyone else in the room that neutrality may not be safe as they thought. I stood up then, not abruptly, calmly. I wanted every movement to say the same thing my words had said. I'm not shouting. I'm not insulting anyone. I'm simply refusing a rule that strips me of dignity and calls it tradition. Then I looked at my husband, and this time my voice softened, not with weakness, but with finality. I told you not to make this bigger, but it was made big the moment your wife was told to eat last in her own family home, and you said nothing. That sentence landed on him differently than everything before it. I could see it, not because it turned him into a hero all of a sudden, it didn't, but because for the first time, his silence itself was no longer blending into the background. It had become part of the moral problem in the room. He could not keep pretending he was merely avoiding drama. His avoidance had a shape now, a cost, a witness. The turning point then was not only the line I said. It was the moment the whole room was forced to confront what had been hidden inside house rules and family ways. The moment labor stopped looking natural and started looking demanded. The moment a daughter-in-law refused to audition for acceptance by swallowing public disrespect. And the moment my husband's silence was exposed as a decision, not a personality trait. And the moment my mother-in-law realized the new bride she thought she had trained on day one was not, in fact, trainable in the way she had hoped. After that, nothing could go back to how it had been 20 minutes earlier. That's what turning points do. They don't solve everything instantly. They simply make return impossible. Once truth is spoken clearly enough, the old arrangement can survive only through open force, not polite illusion. And polite illusion was exactly what had just been shattered. The room was still quiet, but not the same kind of quiet. This quiet was alive, fractured, waiting. Everyone knew something had shifted. My mother-in-law was no longer speaking from unquestioned authority. My husband was no longer sheltered by vagueness. And I was no longer the smiling new daughter-in-law they could place anywhere they pleased. Now, the question was not whether I would cook. The question was what this family would do now that I had refused to disappear. What happened after that was not one clean explosion. It was more intense than that, because real family confrontations rarely unfold in a straight line. They move in waves. Someone tries to regain control, someone else tries to smooth things over, old loyalties tighten, buried resentments rise. Silence becomes impossible, but honesty still frightens
everyone in the room. That was the energy swallowing the house after I said what I said. The air felt sharp, heavy, like every object in that dining area had suddenly become aware that something much larger than breakfast was being decided. My mother-in-law was the first to move. Not physically at first, but emotionally. You could see her searching for the version of the situation that gave her the strongest advantage. Outrage? Wounded elder? Disrespected mother? Keeper of family values under attack by a proud new wife? She had worn those masks before, I'm sure. The problem now was that none of them fit as perfectly as they used to, because I had already named what she was doing too clearly. Still, she tried. She drew herself up and said, with that trembling indignation people use when they think age alone should shield them from accountability, "So this is what my son married? A woman who comes into my home and insults our ways on her first day?" There it was again. Not what she had done, what I had done by refusing it. That was always the game. Shift the focus from the original insult to the discomfort caused by naming it. Make the woman defending herself seem more disruptive than the person who humiliated her. It's such an old pattern, and yet, in the middle of it, it can still shake you if you're not anchored. I felt the sting of her words, yes, but I did not let them move me backward. I said, "No, what your son married is a woman who knows the difference between family and servitude." That sentence landed harder than I expected. Maybe because by then, no one in the room could hide behind misunderstanding anymore. My words had become too direct for that. My mother-in-law's face changed instantly. She was not just angry now, she was losing control of the narrative, and people like her feel that as humiliation. The same humiliation she tried to assign to me had now begun circling back toward her, not because I insulted her, but because truth was forcing everyone to look at what she had normalized. My husband stepped in then, finally moving closer, but not in the way I had once hoped he would. He looked anxious, defensive, trapped between two women and desperate for the old quiet to return. "Can we please stop using these words?" he said. "Nobody's saying you're a servant. Mom's just old school, that's all." That phrase, "just old school," almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. Men like him will shrink an injury into a style preference if it allows them to avoid confronting the people who they fear. Old school, traditional, set in his ways. It all sounds harmless until you ask who is paying for those ways with their dignity. I looked at him and said, "Old school for who? Who eats last? Who serves? Who waits? Who gets taught respect through hunger while everyone else gets taught comfort?" He had no answer, not a real one, and because he had no real answer, his frustration started turning toward me. That is another pattern people don't talk about enough. When someone lacks the courage to confront the source of a problem, they often resent the person who made the problem impossible to ignore. It is easier to blame the truth teller for the tension than the person who created the injustice. I saw that shift in his face, and it hurt, but it also clarified everything. My mother-in-law took advantage of his weakness immediately. "Exactly," she said, looking at him now instead of me. "This is what happens when a woman comes into a family with no humility. She doesn't want to learn, she wants to rule." Rule. That word told me more than she intended, because to a controlling person, equality always feels like rebellion. If you are used to women obeying without question, then a woman asking to be treated with basic dignity can look to you like a power grab. That's how warped the structure had become in that house. Me asking to sit and eat with the family was being framed as dominance. Her demanding I wait until everyone else finished was being framed as order. And then something happened that changed the entire energy of the room. It was not my husband. It was not some miraculous awakening from any of the men. It was his aunt, the same older woman who had murmured earlier that eating after everyone else was not the same as respect. She sat up straighter now and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "She is not wrong." That was the first true crack. You could feel it. The room seemed to recoil and lean in at the same time. My mother-in-law turned to her in disbelief, the kind of disbelief only powerful people feel when someone from within the system speaks against them. "What did you say?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I said, "She is not wrong. Respect is one thing. Humiliation is another. A new bride should not be told to wait for scraps while everyone else eats." Scraps. The word hit the room like a slap, because again, it named the ugly thing directly. It took what had been dressed up as family custom and revealed the meanness hidden underneath it. And once that happened, silence could no longer protect everyone equally. People had to start choosing their discomfort. One of the younger cousins, a woman who had barely spoken in my presence before, quietly added, "We all hated that rule." She said it so softly that under other circumstances it might have been ignored, but in that moment, every word mattered. We just never said anything. That was when the climax truly arrived, because now this was no longer just about me and my mother-in-law. It was about a whole system of female silence inside that family beginning to crack in public. And my mother-in-law knew it. You could see panic trying to hide itself inside her anger. She was no longer just fighting me. She was fighting the possibility that other women in the family might start reinterpreting years of normalized obedience through the language I had given them. She snapped, "So now everyone wants to disrespect me in my own house?" And there was the final refuge of unchecked authority. Ownership. My house, my rules, my sacrifice, my son, my right. People who build themselves into the center of a family start confusing control with love because too many people have benefited for calling it that. But by then, even that line sounded different, smaller, less moral, more territorial. I stood up then fully, not because I was leaving just yet, but because I needed the room to understand that I was no longer speaking from a seated position of defense. I was speaking as a woman who had decided what she would and would not accept. I said, "No, what's happening is that for the first time, people are saying out loud that this is not respect. It is not family. It is not tradition. It is one woman being told to prove she belongs by acting beneath everyone else." My husband looked wrecked by then. Not noble, not even brave yet, just exposed, because every word I said pushed him further into a corner where he had to decide what kind of man he was going to be. And finally, perhaps because the room had shifted too much for him to pretend it was a minor misunderstanding anymore, he turned to his mother and said, in a voice low but audible, "Mom, she should have eaten with us." It was not enough to erase what he had failed to do the day before. It was not enough to make me forget his silence, but it mattered. In that room, at that moment, it mattered. Because once he said it, the lie that this was all my overreaction became much harder to sustain. The son she expected to hide behind her authority had stepped, however belatedly, out of line. My mother-in-law looked at him as if he had betrayed her, and maybe, in her mind, he had, because controlling people don't experience boundaries as fairness, they experience them as abandonment. "What did you just say?" she asked him. He swallowed and repeated it, this time a little stronger. "She should have eaten with us." Those 4 words, "she's my wife," should have come much sooner. They should have come the moment his mother laid down that rule. They should have come before I ever had to speak for myself in that house. But still, when they arrived, they changed the room. Because now, the battle lines were visible in a way that they had not been before. It was no longer just me and my mother-in-law standing alone against family tradition. It was the family being forced to reckon with the fact that marriage had changed the loyalties in the room, whether anyone liked it or not. My mother-in-law's composure cracked then. Not theatrically, but enough. Her voice rose. "After everything I've done for this family, now I'm the villain because I asked for respect?" And that was the moment I knew she had lost moral control of the room, because the only way she could keep her position now was by pretending she was the wounded party in a conflict created by my refusal to obey. But too many truths had already been spoken. Too many women had quietly confirmed what they felt. Too many people had heard the rule repeated plainly. She could still be angry, she could still punish, she could sulk or manipulate or nurse the injury for years, but she could no longer fully hide behind innocence. I said one last thing then, and I think it was the sentence that settled the confrontation.
I said, I did not come into this family to take your place. I came to build a life with your son, but I will not build that life on top of my own humiliation. That line changed even me as I said it, because it was the clearest expression of what I had been fighting for all along. Not dominance, not revenge, not to win some household war. Just a life that did not require me to disappear in order to keep everyone else comfortable. Nobody answered immediately. The room was still, but not frozen now. More like it was absorbing impact. My husband looked at me differently then, not with full understanding, not even with full courage yet, but with the first trace of realizing how close he had come to losing something fundamental before the marriage had even begun. His aunt looked down, almost emotional. The younger cousin was relieved and frightened at the same time. And my mother-in-law looked like someone who had expected to discipline a new bride and instead had triggered a reckoning she could no longer fully contain. That was the climax. Not just my refusal to cook, not just the line I delivered, but the moment the whole house had to admit that I was not there to be trained through humiliation. I was not there to earn family by performing inferiority. I was not another woman willing to carry disrespect quietly so everyone else could call the atmosphere peaceful. Something had broken in that room, yes, but not my dignity. What broke was the illusion that I would accept my place at the bottom of the table and call it love. And once that illusion broke, everything that came after had to be built on different terms. A further confrontation, nobody in that house really knew what to do with the silence after that. It was no longer the same silence, the useful kind that protects hierarchy by keeping everyone polite and vague. This silence was heavier. Exposed. It had the strange, uncomfortable weight of a room that had just watched truth step out from behind custom and refuse to go back into hiding. My mother-in-law, for all her authority, had lost something in that moment that she could not immediately get back. Not control of the house, exactly. That would have been too simple. What she lost was unquestioned moral certainty. She could still be angry, she could still insist, she could still tell herself she was right. But the room had changed. Too many people had now heard the same thing, plainly. Too many little quiet loyalties had shifted just enough. And once that happens, the old order can survive only through force, not respect. She did not apologize. I didn't expect her to. Women like her rarely do when the apology would require them to admit that what they call family values is really just been a system of female obedience with better branding. Instead, she did what controlling people often do when direct pressure fails. She withdrew into injured dignity. She became colder, more formal, more precise with her words. She moved through the house as if she had been deeply wronged by everyone's ingratitude, especially mine. It was an old strategy, and not an ineffective one. Sulking is a form of punishment in families like that. It teaches everyone that challenging the matriarch will cost them peace. It makes ordinary moments feel tense. It forces the room to choose between honest discomfort and obedient calm. For a while, the house lived inside that tension. Breakfast was made, but not by me. Lunch appeared, but not through some magical household process everyone had always taken for granted. Suddenly, there were questions. Who was cooking? Who was serving? Why did things feel strained?
It is remarkable how quickly a family notices women's labor when it is no longer being given invisibly. The same work treated as natural, expected, and beneath acknowledgement becomes very visible the moment it is absent. That was part of the resolution too, not just that I refused, but that my refusal forced the household to confront how much it had depended on women doing extra while pretending it cost nothing. My husband and I had our real conversation that night. Not the weak, dodging half conversation from the night before, the real one. Behind a closed door, no audience, no mother to hide behind, no table of relatives to perform normalcy for, just him and me and the consequences of what his silence exposed. He looked tired in a different way now, stripped of the easy comfort of pretending this would all smooth itself over if I would just stop naming things. And I was tired too. But my tiredness had changed. It no longer felt like confusion. It felt like clarity after impact. I asked him something simple. If I had stayed quiet, how long were you going to let that continue? He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than any polished sentence could, because men who are conflict avoidant often mistake delay for neutrality. They tell themselves they're waiting for the right time, trying not to make things worse, keeping balance, respecting everyone's feelings. But what they are really doing is letting the strongest personality in the room define reality, while pretending time itself will solve what they are too afraid to confront. He finally said something that mattered more than whether it was perfect. He said, "I should have said something immediately." It wasn't grand, it wasn't eloquent, it didn't undo the hurt, but it was the first honest thing he had said about the whole situation. And sometimes, honesty, even late, is the first real doorway out of damage if the person walking towards it is willing to keep going. I told him the truth then, without softening it. I told him I had not married him to become useful to his mother. I told him I was not interested in a marriage where his family got first claim on my dignity and I got whatever was left after everyone else felt comfortable. I told him love that requires silence in the face of humiliation is not love I can safely live inside. And then I told him the hardest part. If you cannot protect the line between being a wife and being household labor, then I cannot stay in that line with you. That sentence changed him, not magically, not completely, but visibly. Because until then, I think some part of him still believed this was a painful but manageable conflict, one of those early marriage tensions people eventually laugh about if everyone just calms down enough. But what he hadn't understood was that for me, this was not about one meal. It was about the structure of the life we were beginning. It was about whether I was expected to negotiate for my humanity each time his family felt entitled to it. And once he realized I was willing to walk away from that structure rather than adjust to it, he finally understood the stakes. The next morning, he spoke to his mother privately. I didn't hear every word, but I heard enough through the walls to know the old ease was gone. His voice was firmer than I had heard him before in relation to her. Hers rose in disbelief more than once. I heard my name. I heard my wife. I heard not acceptable. I heard the same wounded mother language from her that people like her always use when adult children begin setting boundaries. After all I've done, so she comes first now? You're choosing her over family? That's always the accusation, isn't it? As if marriage is supposed to create a new center. As if asking a man to stand beside his wife is some selfish attack on the mother who raised him. But the old machinery was not working as cleanly anymore because the issue had been dragged too clearly into the light. He came out of that conversation looking shaken, but also resolved. He told me, quietly, that things were going to change, that I would eat with the family or not, that no one would assign me kitchen duties as proof of my place, that if his mother could not respect that, we would leave and find somewhere else to stay. I looked at him for a long moment before responding, because by then I had learned not to confuse good words with proven safety. But this was the first time he had spoken like a husband with a spine, instead of a son hoping everyone else could absorb his mother's will for him. It mattered. Not because it repaired everything instantly, but because it created a path. Some stories end with everybody hugging and understanding one another. This was not that kind of story. My mother-in-law did not wake up transformed. She did not come to me with tears and admit she treated me unfairly. She did not suddenly start seeing me as an equal because one confrontation had forced the issue. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more realistic. She backed down outwardly because the line had been drawn and my husband had finally stood beside it. She didn't like it. She made that clear in dozens of indirect ways over the next days and weeks. Colder greetings, sharper pauses, the kind of small social frost that lets you know she considered herself overruled, not enlightened. But the rule itself did not return. That mattered more than her mood. The next family meal was one of the strangest meals of my life. Everyone sat with an awareness so thick it almost had texture. Plates were arranged, food was passed. My mother-in-law moved more stiffly than usual. My husband pulled out a chair beside him and looked at me in a way that was both apologetic and deliberate. A seat at the table. Such a basic thing, and yet after what had happened, it felt almost revolutionary. I sat down. No speeches, no dramatic comments, just a chair and a decision. Sometimes dignity returns in very small-looking moments. Sometimes the most powerful outcome is not a grand victory, but the restoration of what should never have been denied. I noticed the women in the room, too. The aunt who had spoken, the younger cousin who had admitted quietly that they all hated that rule, the way their eyes flickered towards me and then away again, not with pity now, but something else. Recognition, maybe? Relief? Maybe even possibility. Because that is another truth people don't say enough. When one woman refuses humiliation, does not only change her own position, it can change the emotional mathematics for every woman watching. It gives language to things others have survived silently. It makes old customs feel less sacred and more negotiable. It reminds people that just because something has lasted a long time does not mean it deserves to keep living. The longer-term resolution came a little later, and in some ways it was the most important part. My husband and I moved out sooner than originally planned. That decision, more than any dinner table correction, was what really secured the future of our marriage. Because boundaries are much harder to maintain when you are living inside the emotional headquarters of the person who resents them. We needed our own space, our own rhythms, our own table where no one could assign me worth based on usefulness or proximity to a kitchen. Leaving was not dramatic, it was necessary, and necessary decisions are often the least glamorous and most life-saving ones you will ever make. My mother-in-law treated that move as proof that I had divided the family. Of course she did. People who benefit from access call distance betrayal. But by then, I was no longer interested in being seen as good by standards designed to erase me. I had learned too much too quickly. I had seen what happened when politeness is mistaken for permission. I had seen how fast a woman can be recast as difficult the moment she stops making other people comfortable at her own expense. And I had also seen something just as important. Once I stopped begging to be understood and simply stood inside the truth of what I would not accept, the room had to rearrange itself around that clarity. Was it easy after that? No. Families carry grudges and long shadows. There were awkward visits, tense holidays, small comments dropped like pebbles in still water to see if they would ripple. My mother-in-law never fully forgave me for refusing the roles she imagined for me, but forgiveness from her stopped being the prize. Peace built on my obedience stopped being the prize. The prize became something much more solid. Self-respect in my own marriage. A husband beginning, however imperfectly, to understand that love without protection is fragile. A home where I was not expected to prove belonging by eating last while everyone else consumed the labor of my silence. And perhaps the deepest part of the resolution was internal, because something changed in me permanently after that. Before, I still believed that if I was respectful enough, calm enough, generous enough, patient enough, people would eventually meet me fairly. After that first week as a daughter-in-law, I understood something far more useful. Some people do not take your respect as a cue to respect you back. They take it as a test of how much you will tolerate. And if you do not answer early, they build a whole structure on top of your hesitation. That lesson was painful, but it gave me a clearer life. I no longer confused being nice with being safe. I no longer believed every tradition deserves reverence simply because it has survived unchallenged. I no longer thought dignity had to wait politely until everyone else had eaten first. And I no longer apologized for the kind of calm refusal that protects a woman from being quietly assigned to the bottom of her own life. So, yes, I smiled when my mother-in-law told me I had to eat last. Yes, I agreed in the moment. And the next day, I refused to cook. Because I understood something she didn't. The first rule a family tries to place on a new woman often reveals exactly what they think she is there for. My resolution was not that I won some household battle. It was that I refused to let my marriage begin with a lie about my place in it. And once I refused to that lie, everything else, my husband's choice, the family's adjustment, the move, the changed dynamic, had to grow around the truth. When I think about that first day now, what stays with me is not the food, not the plates, not even the exact words, although I can still hear them if I let myself. What stays with me is the speed with which a woman can be told who she is expected to become in a new family. Sometimes it happens with affection, sometimes with advice, sometimes with little jokes everybody laughs at except the person being tested. And sometimes, like it did with me, it happens through something as basic and symbolic as who gets to sit, who gets to serve, and who is told their hunger can wait. That is why I never call what happened to me just a dinner issue. It was never just about eating last. It was about being placed last. That is a completely different thing. It was about whether my first lesson as a daughter-in-law would be that my needs belonged at the bottom of the room, that my place in the family had to be earned through labor and silence, and that the quickest way to be accepted was to make myself useful enough that no one had to treat me like an equal. And maybe the hardest part of stories like this is how often people miss that distinction. They hear the surface event and think, well, it's only one meal, only one custom, only one old-fashioned rule. But women know better. Women know that households teach you your rank through repetition, through rituals, through who gets served and who keeps serving, through what happens the first time someone says, "This is how it's done here," and waits to see whether you will swallow yourself to fit inside it. That is why the first no matters so much. Not because every boundary has to become a battle, not because every old tradition is abuse, and not because a woman can never choose service freely and joyfully. I believe she can. Love often does serve. Real family care involves effort, giving, generosity, sacrifice even. But the difference that changes everything, is choice. Love offered freely is not the same as labor demanded through hierarchy. Feeding people you love is not the same as proving your worth by waiting until they are done to feed yourself. A woman setting the table with joy is not the same as a woman being told she earns her place only by staying on her feet while everyone else sits comfortably around her. That distinction is where dignity lives. And once you understand that, you start seeing so much more clearly. You start noticing how often disrespect puts on a clean shirt and calls it tradition, how often control speaks softly and asks to be admired for being old-fashioned, how often women are praised for patience when what people really mean is endurance, how often a family will talk about harmony while depending entirely on one woman's silence to maintain it. We are asked so often to confuse accommodation with virtue, to believe that the more discomfort we can absorb without complaint, the more respectable we become. But there is nothing noble about teaching a woman to disappear and then calling her graceful for vanishing well. I think that's what changed most in me after that experience. I stopped romanticizing the idea of being endlessly understanding in spaces that were not being equally humane in return. I stopped assuming that if I just showed enough kindness, enough maturity, enough flexibility, people would automatically recognize my humanity and meet me there. Some people do, good people do, but others don't. Others read softness as access. They read patience as permission. They read silence as a vacancy waiting to be filled with their expectations. And if you don't interrupt that reading early, they will build a whole relationship on top of it. That is not bitterness. That is clarity. There's also something else I had to learn, and I think a lot of women, especially Black women, will understand this in their bones. There are moments when defending yourself carries a social cost that people outside your experience do not appreciate. We are not only deciding whether to speak, we are deciding how we will be interpreted after we speak. We know the difference between being heard as wounded and being dismissed as too much. We know how quickly calm can be expected from us, even in moments that would justify anger in anyone else. We know that one sharp tone can erase the entire history of what was done to us in the minds of people eager to avoid discomfort. So when people ask, why didn't you say something immediately, they often reveal that they have never had to measure the political cost of their own self-defense in the same way. But here's the lesson I took from that. Caution is understandable, but permanent caution can become its own trap. If you spend too long trying to craft the perfect acceptable response, the structure you are resisting might settle around you before you ever open your mouth. That was the truth I had to face that first night. My fear of being misread was real. My awareness of stereotype was real. My desire not to become the difficult new daughter-in-law was real. But if I let those fears govern me completely, I would have entered a role I never agreed to and then spent years trying to claw my way out of it. Sometimes the price of being liked is simply too high if what people like is your willingness to shrink. So what saved me in the end was not loudness. And I want to say that carefully, because I think too many people tell women they must become fearless in a flashy way. That was not my story. I was afraid, deeply. But I was also clear. And clarity, when held calmly, can be more disruptive than anger could ever be. My mother-in-law was prepared for emotion. She was prepared for hurt. She was prepared for tears, sulking, maybe even a private complaint she could dismiss. What she was not prepared for was a woman who understood exactly what had happened, refused to be trapped by the packaging of it, and answered with consequence instead of pleading. That was the real shift. I did not ask her to see me differently. I behaved in a way that made her inability to see me correctly no longer my responsibility. That changed everything. It also taught me something profound about silence. Silence is not always weakness. It depends on what the silence is doing. There is a silence that comes from fear swallowing your voice, and that silence can destroy you slowly. But there is also a silence that gathers you, that lets your feelings settle enough for your truth to become precise, that helps you distinguish between wanting to react and needing to respond. My smile on that first day was not victory, and it was not surrender. It was the space between injury and strategy. The dangerous little pause in which a woman decides whether she will be rewritten by the room or whether she will write her own answer before morning. I think that pause is where many women live more often than anyone realizes. Not everyone sees it from the outside, but inside it is full of work. Memory, calculation, fear, self-respect, ancestral wisdom, every warning your mother ever gave you, every compromise you swore you would never make, every stereotype you're trying not to trigger, every future version of yourself standing in the doorway asking, if you let this happen now, what else will they ask of you later? That was the work happening in me that night, and by morning, I knew my answer. There's one more thing this story taught me that I carry everywhere now. A person's first unreasonable demand often contains the whole blueprint of the relationship they want with you. That doesn't mean every conflict is fatal, but it does mean first demands matter. Watch what someone asks you to normalize early. Watch what they expect you to swallow just this once. Watch the first thing they ask you to do that costs your dignity but flatters their authority. That moment tells you almost everything. If someone needs your discomfort in order to feel respected, they do not want mutual love. They want hierarchy. If someone calls your self-respect rebellion, they were counting on your obedience. And if a family welcomes you only through service, then your response in that first moment matters more than any speech they will later give about unity and peace. Because peace without dignity is only quiet suffering with nicer branding. I know there are people who hear stories like mine and think the moral is simple, stand up for yourself and everything changes. But real life is harder than that. Sometimes standing up costs you. Sometimes the room doesn't shift. Sometimes the husband never finds his spine. Sometimes the family doubles down. Sometimes the relationship ends because the structure underneath it was never built to hold your dignity in the first place. That is also real. So the lesson isn't a fairy tale. The lesson is not that speaking guarantees a happy ending. The lesson is that silence guarantees nothing, except that other people get more time to turn your pain into routine. And once pain becomes routine in a family, it starts getting called normal. That is what I refused. Normalized humiliation, ritualized self-erasure, the expectation that my role as a wife should begin with proving I could be useful enough to overlook my own hurt. I refused to sit in that chair, or rather, I refused to stand outside the table pretending it was enough to be near it. So yes, I smiled when she told me I had to eat last. Yes, I agreed in the moment. And yes, the next day, I refused to cook. Because what some people call a small thing is often the first rehearsal for a much bigger life. And I had no intention of rehearsing my own disappearance. That is the takeaway I carry most strongly now. Respect that depends on your humiliation is not respect. Tradition that only costs.
Sometimes a woman is not sacred. Family that welcomes you only through service is not really welcoming you. And a woman does not owe anyone gratitude for being allowed to stand in a room where her dignity is treated as optional. Sometimes a calmest refusal is the one that saves your future. Sometimes the first boundary is the most important one. Sometimes the sentence that shocks a room is simply the first honest description of what everyone has been pretending not to see. And sometimes the moment you stop agreeing to eat last is the moment your life finally stops being arranged around everybody else's comfort. The strange thing about moments that change a family is that the actual turning point is often shorter than the shadow it leaves behind. The confrontation itself might last minutes, maybe an hour if people keep circling the same wound from different angles. But the aftermath can stretch for months, sometimes years, because now everyone has to live inside what was exposed. That was true for us. After I refused to cook and said what I said, life did not become instantly peaceful just because a boundary had finally been named. In some ways, the hardest part began afterward, when the house had to keep functioning in the presence of a truth it could no longer fully deny. For the first few days, everything felt unnaturally formal. The kind of formal that isn't about good manners, but emotional distance. My mother-in-law no longer gave me instructions as if my labor belonged to her by default, but she also didn't speak to me with any real warmth. Every word from her had a clipped precision to it, as though she were determined to show the household that she was withholding something important and everyone should notice. She moved around me not with the relaxed authority of before, but with the rigid control of someone trying to recover ground after a public loss. That is another thing controlling people do when they can't win directly. They create atmosphere. They make the room itself carry their resentment so they do not have to say every thought out loud. And if I'm honest, that atmosphere got to me sometimes too. Not because I regretted what I did, but because tension in a home is exhausting in a way people underestimate. When every meal feels like a quiet referendum on your presence, your nervous system pays for it. You start measuring footsteps, reading pauses, noticing the tone behind little phrases. You become fluent in emotional weather because you have to be. There were moments I would walk into the kitchen and feel that slight tightening in my chest before anything had even happened, simply because the room still remembered. The walls still remembered. Everybody did. My husband was trying, but trying and understanding are not the same thing. That was one of the first hard truths of the aftermath. He had finally stood beside me in the moment that mattered, yes. He had spoken to his mother. He had agreed to boundaries. He had made it clear I would not be treated that way again. Those things mattered, and I do not take them lightly. But emotional habits do not disappear overnight just because a crisis forces clarity. He was still conflict avoidant in all the little reflexive ways that had helped create the problem in the first place. He still wanted things to settle down faster than I could. He still occasionally acted as if my discomfort after the fact should soften more quickly now that the main issue had technically been addressed. Men often think resolution begins the second they finally do what they should have done earlier. They don't always understand that for the woman who carried the hurt, resolution begins much later, after trust starts earning its way back through repetition. We had more conversations in that period than we had ever had before. Real conversations, messy ones, honest ones, sometimes painful in their simplicity. I told him I was not just upset by his silence at the table, I was changed by it. There's a difference. Being hurt is one thing. Seeing someone differently is another. I needed him to understand that I had entered marriage expecting partnership, and what I experienced in that room shaken my confidence in whether he understood the weight of that word at all. I told him that if his instinct under pressure was always to disappear into politeness while I absorbed the disrespect, then our marriage would always be one family dinner away from collapse. It wasn't enough for him to agree with me later in private. I needed him to become the kind of husband who could recognize humiliation while it was happening, not after it had already left a bruise on me. To his credit, he listened more deeply than he had at the beginning. Not perfectly, not without defensiveness, and not without moments where I still wanted to shake him and ask why basic things had to be explained at all. But he listened. And over time, I began to see that the confrontation had changed him too. Not all at once, but in the way real growth usually happens. Awkwardly, imperfectly, in repeated choices. He started stepping in sooner when his mother made little comments. He stopped asking me to ignore things for peace. He became more willing to let discomfort stay in the room instead of rushing to cover it. Those may sound like small changes, but for someone raised inside a family where women's emotional labor kept everyone else comfortable, they were not small. They were structural. Moving out helped more than anything. I cannot overstate that. Distance did what arguments alone could not. It gave our marriage air. It removed us from the daily fear of my mother-in-law's authority and forced us to build habits that belonged to us, not to the house we were reacting to. In our own place, simple things felt almost healing. Cooking because we were hungry, not because someone was testing my role. Sitting down at our own table without symbolic rank attached to every gesture. It's amazing how many ordinary rituals become sacred once they are no longer loaded with power.
I remember the first time we ate dinner in our new place. Just the two of us. Boxes still half unpacked, one lamp not working, takeout containers instead of proper plates because we hadn't found everything yet. By any polished standard, it was a mess. But I sat there and felt a kind of peace I didn't know I was missing. No one watching, no one assigning, and no one deciding what my position at the table said about my worth. Just food and breathing and room to exist. I think that was the first time I understood in my body, not just my mind, that dignity doesn't always arrive like triumph. Sometimes it arrives like quiet, like a meal with no hidden lesson in it. My mother-in-law did not like the move, of course. She framed it exactly the way I knew she would. I had turned her son against her. I had divided the family. I had come in too proud to learn how things were done. She did not say all of it directly to me every time, but it lived in the atmosphere of every interaction after that. In the cool greetings, the selective memory, the way she told stories about how women used to understand sacrifice with pointed glances meant for me without using my name. But by then, something fundamental had changed in me. I no longer needed her approval badly enough to confuse it with peace. That may have been one of the most important things I gained from the whole experience. Freedom from the exhausting desire to be seen as good by someone invested in seeing my boundaries as disrespect. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It did. There's grief in realizing a relationship may never become warm simply because you approached it sincerely. There's sadness in understanding that some people would rather keep their version of power than gain a more honest kind of closeness. I grieved that. I grieved the mother-in-law relationship I had hoped for, the one where guidance did not require hierarchy and family did not require swallowing yourself to belong. I grieved the easier version of marriage I thought I was stepping into, the one where my husband and I would not need to learn so early how much damage one silence can do. Those were real losses, even though I would make the same choice again. What surprised me most in the aftermath was how many women quietly reached for me in one form or another. Not always dramatically, not always with speeches. Sometimes it was a cousin texting me later to say, "I wish I had said something years ago." Sometimes it was the aunt who spoke in the room just to ask how I was settling in, and then pausing long enough for me to hear the deeper meaning in the question. Sometimes it was a friend who heard the story and said, "That happened to my mother. She never challenged it." Those moments stayed with me because they reminded me that what we call family culture is often just accumulated female silence, layer upon layer of women deciding the cost of resistance is too high, until one day the rule itself starts looking ancient and respectable simply because it has survived unchallenged for so long. I think that's why the younger women in the family looked at me differently after that. Not all with affection, not all with bravery, but with awareness. They had seen something happen that they were not used to seeing. A woman had refused the rule at the moment it was handed to her. Not years later, after resentment had turned bitter, not privately where the family could erase it. Right there, in daylight, calmery. And even if they never said it, I know it did something to the imagination of what was possible around them. Sometimes one woman's refusal does not liberate everyone, but it does make obedience look less inevitable. There were awkward holidays after that. I won't romanticize it. Family systems do not reorganize themselves neatly because one conflict went the right way. At some gatherings, my mother-in-law overcompensated, insisting too brightly that everyone eat together now, as if she had always believed in such fairness. At others, there were smaller tests. Tiny comments, delayed invitations, strategic exclusions disguised as oversight. Power rarely disappears, it mutates, it looks for new openings. But the difference was, I was no longer walking into those spaces unsure of my own reading. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened. And most importantly, I knew I would leave a room before I allowed myself to be quietly repositioned in it again. That knowledge changes the entire way you inhabit your own life. The aftermath also deepened my understanding of hunger in a way I didn't expect. Not literal hunger, though that mattered too in the moment. Symbolic hunger. The the hunger to belong, the hunger to be received kindly, the hunger to enter a family and not be treated like an intruder who has to earn oxygen through service. I think a lot of women get manipulated through that hunger, especially at the beginning.
Especially at the beginning of marriage. We want to start well. We want to be loved. We want to prove we are not the stereotype someone feared. And because we want these things sincerely, we become vulnerable to people who know exactly how to exploit that sincerity. The lesson I carried from my aftermath was not stop wanting love. It was subtler than that. Want love, yes, but do not hunger for acceptance so badly that you consume your own dignity to get it. That became one of my internal guardrails. In every difficult interaction afterward, whether with his family or in other areas of life, I started asking myself a simple question. What am I being asked to normalize here? Not what am I being asked to tolerate for one awkward afternoon, not how can I keep this from becoming a scene, but what would this become if I accepted it as ordinary? That question saved me more than once, because it pulled me out of the immediate emotional fog and into the longer arc of consequence. A lot of disrespect survives because it is introduced in small doses, small enough to question your own reaction, small enough to seem survivable. But survivable is not the same as acceptable. The aftermath taught me to respect that distinction fiercely. And maybe the most beautiful part of the aftermath was that I became softer with myself. That might sound strange after a story of conflict, but it's true. Standing up for yourself in a room that was prepared to misread you can leave a woman feeling strong on the outside and terribly exposed on the inside. I had moments after everything settled where I questioned myself anyway. Was I too sharp? Too early? Too final? Could I have handled it another way? But over time, as the dust settled and I saw more clearly what that household expected from me, I stopped interrogating my self-respect as if it were the problem. I began speaking to myself with more tenderness. Of course you reacted. Of course it hurt. Of course you could not build a life inside that rule. That tenderness mattered. Healing is not just boundaries with other people, it is also the end of putting yourself on trial for refusing to be mistreated. If there's one image that captures the aftermath for me, it's a much smaller one than the confrontation itself. It's me in my own kitchen later, months later, making dinner because I wanted to, music low in the background, my husband setting plates without being asked, and there being no tension attached to who would sit first or serve last. Just a meal. Just partnership. Just the absence of a hierarchy I once almost got swallowed into. I stood there for a second that night and had this strange wave of emotion because I realized how easily ordinary dignity can be taken for granted by people who have always had it. To sit and eat as family, to prepare food without proving your place through it, to be loved without being tested through humiliation. These should be basic things, but when you've had to fight for them once, you never stop recognizing their value. So yes, the aftermath was messy. It held grief and awkwardness and growth and lingering resentment and 1,000 tiny recalibrations of family dynamics. But it also held something precious. Evidence. Evidence that one calm refusal can alter the emotional map of a household. Evidence that marriage can still be rebuilt honestly if both people are willing to look at what their silence has cost. Evidence that women watching from the edges of a room can feel less alone when someone finally says what everyone has been pretending not to see. And evidence that the first boundary you draw in a new life may echo much longer than the moment in which you speak it.
I still think about that first meal sometimes, not with rage anymore, more with clarity, because now I understand it for what it was. Not the start of my training, but the start of my refusal. And everything good that came after, our own home, a stronger marriage, a different sense of self, a different standard for what family can ask of me, grew from that refusal. Not because standing up is always easy, but because some lines once crossed in silence become very difficult to erase. I am grateful I chose mine early.